So I'm kind of excited because we're starting a new series today, and I try to find fun names for my series when I can. So today we're starting out with the F words. So I'll explain that in just a minute. But before I do, I wanted to kind of start out with a little story. And I was talking with Ginger and Diane about this a bit this morning, is that, today is Halloween on a Sunday, and that doesn't happen very often, roughly every 5 or 6 years sort of thing. And which had me thinking about a particular trip I took back in 1993, which I know is almost 30 years ago. I know I don't look old enough for that to be true. But it was a trip I took. I went back when I lived in New York City. I was coming up to New England, and I remember because 1993, Halloween was on a Sunday as well. And so, as I tend to do, I try to pack too many things in my weekend. So I travel up to go to kind of the Halloween events in Salem, and I know that the best things don't really happen until nighttime back then, so I figure I can do something else during the daytime. So I actually drive from Salem, Mass, up to Pawtuckaway State Park, which is a little over an hour away, because I can get some hiking in before this starts. So I drive on up there, and as I get there, I don't go into the main entrance of the park. There are some other entrances that kind of take you in around back, and they're kind of dirt roads to take you in. And I get in there, I just want to kind of just randomly hike for a bit. The problem is that if you park your car back there, since you're not really using the regularly marked trails, how do you find your car? Well, thankfully, I had actually recently gotten what was very cutting-edge technology at that time, a GPS receiver. Now, keep in mind, this is a GPS receiver of 30 years ago, not your phone, which means that it didn't have maps. It didn't have any of that kind of stuff. You know what you got? Latitude and longitude, direction of travel, altitude, sort of thing is what you got. And they were very low sensitivity. They were great big devices like that big, probably weighed, 8 or 10 ounces sort of thing. Big rectangular antennas you had to have pointing at the sky. It was going to work. But it had one really cool feature that I liked. It had this marker feature where you could say that, here's a place I want to remember. In this case, my car. So I could drop a marker where the car is, and it would help me find my way back to it later. I had faith that that was going to be true. So I head out hiking. I go into the mountains. I'm kind of wandering and bouncing about and so forth, and things are going well. But I watch the time, and I realize that I've got about a half hour, 45-minute hike back, hour plus drive back into Salem. Getting back in later in the day is going to take longer. So I kind of try to plan for all this. So I'm at the top of the hills, clear shot at the sky, bring the GPS up, and you start to wait to get the signals. And today we're extremely spoiled that our phones always know our locations like really fast. Back then you could wait minutes to get that information. So you stand and you wait and you get it and go, okay, car is that direction. That's my direction of travel. I start walking. And I'm walking, and the woods are getting thicker, and the trail is getting thinner, which is not a good sign. So I'm like, I'm okay. I have my GPS device. I fire it up, and I wait, and I wait, and I wait. And it turns out that although I could see the sky, there was not a clear angle between the satellites and me. Therefore, I could not get my location. So what do? I can keep going forward, hoping I'm going the right way, knowing I'm very unlikely to still be going the right way. Or I can make a choice. I can walk backwards a little bit, not way back, but backwards a little bit so I can get a little higher, a little clearer shot of the sky, and maybe I can get a signal, which I did, and it did, and I survived clearly. I'm here today. But as you think about what that experience was, is that I had faith in that GPS, that it would get me back to where I wanted to be. But it let me down. And I felt really lost. I was depending on it. I had faith that it would do what it said it would do. And it didn't. Now, was there a problem with the GPS? Was the GPS broken in some way? No, it did what it does. It was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. The problem was that I was in a place in that moment that I couldn't receive the signal that was coming down that would tell me which way to go. As a result, I didn't know which way to go. And I think that sort of thing happens to us a lot in life. As we go through life and as we do things, we find ourselves stuck and not sure which way to go. So as we go through this series, what I want to look at are some of the things that can help us get unstuck and start to find our way to where we're supposed to be. And it just so happens that all the things we're going to talk about begin with the letter F. And today is faith. So, as we talk about faith, I find faith as kind of an interesting word because it seems that depending on how you use it, it appears to have different meanings. In the sense that when I say I put my faith in the GPS, as we hear that, we're like, well, I'm trusting that it will do what it says it will do. My faith in that GPS receiver does not change the way the GPS receiver works. It works exactly the same whether I have faith in it or not. It does what it does. And in this case, with the GPS receiver, what faith did for me, faith in that GPS, was that it helped me to stick it out when things got tough. When that GPS receiver didn't get its signal, I didn't just throw it down on the ground and go, this thing's worthless, and just sit there and hope something else would come along and save me. I said, I've got to get to a place where I can receive the information that I need to move from here. Now, that's how we think of the word faith in kind of a traditional sense. But somehow, when we start to get it into a religious environment, in a religious environment, sometimes I think we may find that we start redefining faith, that we think that somehow in a religious environment, faith means something different. That we somehow can think that faith is about trying to convince God to do something. That if I have enough faith, I can convince him to do the thing I want to do. But if I don't have enough faith, maybe he won't. I mean, unfortunately, too many people have been deeply hurt because when something goes the wrong way, someone says, well, maybe you should have had more faith. Because faith is not about convincing God to do something. When we think about this idea of having faith in anything, faith is not about convincing something or someone to do something they wouldn't do otherwise. Faith is about trusting that it will do what it says it will do. Even though at any given moment, it may not feel like that's happening. Faith is what gives us the power to stick it out. So as we think about our faith in God, we're not trying to convince God to do something he wouldn't do otherwise. What we're doing with our faith is trusting that by having faith, we can be part of what God is doing. That when we have a faith that God is leading us in a direction, when God is calling us to do something, when God is leading us to interact with a person we may not be comfortable normally interacting with, or to actually care for someone that's really difficult to care for. Faith is trusting that God will bring us through that he will give us that strength. We're not trying to convince him to do anything. Faith enables us to persevere even when the path is challenging. In fact, the writer of Hebrews gives us a clear definition of faith. And the writer of Hebrews, or what we call the Book of Hebrews, is basically a letter written to a bunch of first century Jesus followers. They were experiencing incredible difficulty and incredible persecution and just a challenging environment to get through. And the purpose of the letter of Hebrews is to encourage them, to bring them through, to give them hope to get through. And what the writer of Hebrews tells us is that faith is the certainty of things hoped for, a proof of things not seen. And so what the author is saying is that faith is not about trying to change the outcome. Faith is trusting that God has promised to bring you through this, to bring you into the situation, to bring you to a destination. And the faith allows us to keep going, that without faith, we will be tempted to give up. And if we give up, we miss what he's doing. And we miss the opportunity to be a part of what he's doing. You know, and so often as we think about faith, and there are so many great examples of faith throughout the Bible. And I find it's often helpful that if we can kind of look at people who kind of walked in faith in difficult times, it helps us to do that and to have that assurance that faith comes through. And oftentimes when you ask someone about faith, particularly if you talk about having faith in a really difficult situation, in a situation that seems utterly impossible, there's a common narrative that people will often point to. It's actually a narrative of a guy named Ezekiel. Now, Ezekiel is one of the Old Testament prophets. He lived, we estimate, close to 1,000 years before Jesus. And Ezekiel had a tough job. I mean, he probably had one of the toughest ministry jobs that have ever existed. He was the prophet to the nation of Israel, or what was basically called Jerusalem at that time, when they were conquered by the Babylonians. And he's the guy responsible to saying, don't lose hope. Keep going on. And he'd also been the one responsible to talk to them as things were falling apart. And one of the things that he had to do is he wanted to help them understand that they should have faith in what God is doing, that God has a plan for this, and that God would bring things back together at the right time. But it was hard for people to do. It was hard for people to have that faith because things were so hard for them. And we can even imagine that it was likely very hard for Ezekiel to keep himself pumped up, to keep himself committed to doing that. Because Ezekiel, again, had a lot of hard tasks in front of him. And so Ezekiel actually recorded for us what he experienced during those years. And then we call it the Book of Ezekiel from the Old Testament. But again, it's basically his journal of what he experienced and what he went through. And he records an entry in his journal that on the surface seems kind of strange, but actually packs a ton of information into it. What he records is this: "The Lord took hold of me, and I was carried away by the Spirit of the Lord to a valley filled with bones. He led me all around among the bones that covered the valley floor. They were scattered everywhere across the ground and were completely dried out." So it appears that he's had this vision. He's had this vision of God showing him something. And although we hear that and go, okay, well, it's a valley filled with bones, that seems nasty. For him, there would have been incredible imagery locked into this, because what he would have seen is remnants of a battle. Because remember that he lived in the ancient world. The ancient world was a brutal world where violence was the currency of the time. You want something, you take it. You keep it with violence. So what he saw was the sight of a huge battle where one side had been utterly defeated and destroyed and killed. And then when they were beaten, what he saw were these bones where the bodies had been left to the elements. And it's important to understand that at that time, in that region, there was a belief that you could curse your enemies by leaving their bodies out in the open. In other words, by not burying them. And what it was a way to defeat your enemies, to utterly defeat your enemies, to say that we're not just going to kill you, we're going to curse you beyond death. And what they were doing there was that the image he would have seen is something that is completely lost, irrecoverably lost. There is no way to find life here anymore. That's what he would have seen when he looked at that. What he would have basically seen is hopelessness. And then he tells us that God says, you see all these bones that seem dead to you, that there's no life left? I'm telling you there is life left here. And in order to see that life, I'm going to ask you to do something. God says, I'm going to ask you to call those bones to life. Now that took faith for Ezekiel to do that, because everything that he was seeing would tell him that there is no life left. But God says, no, believe me, there's life still here. I'm going to simply ask you to have enough faith to say, call them back to life. And Ezekiel does that. And Ezekiel calls them back to life. And as he does that, he begins to see changes happen slowly. He begins to see movement. And then he begins to see restoration. until before long, what he actually sees standing before him, instead of a pile of bones, is a strong army. And what he finds is what was once dead and cursed is now alive. And not just alive, but it is powerful and it is purposeful. And what he sees here is that his faith let him see something amazing. His faith did not make those bones come back to life. It was the power of God that brought them back to life. But what his faith did was enable him to be part of what God was doing. And one of the things that we look at when we look at a narrative like this is that it's an incredible story of Ezekiel's faith. And if you read through the life of Ezekiel, he was a guy who had incredible faith, that he seemed to be willing to believe and trust God in the way that I think is very hard for most of us. And he would do what God would tell him, no matter how ridiculous it may have seemed, how impossible it may have seemed. And isn't that nice for Ezekiel? But what about us? What about when we're in a place in our life where finding faith is so hard, finding a way to believe that I can get through this is so hard, finding a way to trust that what looks dead to me is not dead, can actually have life in it? When we're in that place, when we're not like Ezekiel, where that faith just seems to be built in, when we're not there, what do we do? Who's our example? Who do we look to say, what do I do when I feel like that? Well, fortunately, we have somebody. Another guy named Elijah. Now, Elijah's kind of an interesting person because Elijah was a great man of God. Again, lived a few hundred years before Jesus. And he did these amazing things, and he would have these incredible challenges, and he would overcome them, and you kind of look at that, and you're going, well, I don't know if I can be like that. But then one day, something seemed to happen to Elijah. One day, Elijah couldn't do it anymore. One day, he just seems worn out. One day, he appears to say, you know what? I've had one battle too many. I can't do this anymore. And even though his faith had once been strong, he can't seem to find it now. He actually basically declares to God, you know what? I thought I was your guy. I'm not your guy anymore. He's exhausted. He's been working alone too long, and he doesn't think he can keep going on like this anymore. And what ends up happening is that Elijah has lost his hope. And once he loses his hope, he can't seem to find his faith. And that's when he finally says to God, I am ready to give up. This is just too hard. Because what happened is that a big part of having his faith was having hope and being able to continue to operate in his purpose. But now he can't even seem to grab onto his purpose anymore. He's basically telling God, you know, I've carried this as far as I can. Can you just give it to somebody else? Because I can't do it anymore. And although he never stops believing in God's existence, he seems to have lost his connection to God. And he, as far as we can tell, he reaches this point where he doesn't even know what to do next. So what he decides to do is actually, for him, go to his place of worship. And for him, his place of worship was a mountain called Mount Sinai. Now, we don't know for sure why he decided to go to Mount Sinai, but my assumption is he couldn't feel like he could connect with God. So he tried to go back to the place where he'd once been able to connect with God. And for him, that was Mount Sinai. And he goes there after a long journey, and he arrives, and he prays. You know what the first thing he prays is? God, I'm here. I can't do this anymore. I give up. This is hopeless. I don't think I'm the one that can do this. And then he kind of stands, and he appears to be listening to hear from God. And then the narrative gets kind of really strange, because the narrative basically comes along and it says that as he stands there waiting to hear from God, this fierce wind comes blowing in. So fierce that the rocks explode and fly in every direction. And basically it says, but the Lord was not in the wind. Then after the wind, an earthquake begins, and the ground begins to shake, and the ground begins to crack, and the rocks begin to fall. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And then after that, a great fire rises up, and the fire comes flying in and begins to consume and burn things, but we're told the Lord was not in the fire. So after all these huge events, what happens next? Then, as he quiets and he settles down, after the fire was the sound of a gentle whisper. And it's in that whisper that Elijah again begins to connect with God, again begins to hear from God. And again, he opens up to God with what he's struggling with and what he's trying to find. And he tells God that I can't find my direction anymore. I don't know how to go anywhere else. I don't know what to do anymore. That I need some help because I just don't know what to do. And he tells us, but then the Lord said to him, go back the same way you came. And he's told to go to a very specific place. And so what ends up happening is that in that moment, in the quiet of the whisper, Elijah again receives direction. And what's kind of interesting is that where he finds direction as he heads back, as he gets there, he finds things that he didn't see before. He begins to find help to help him through it. And we see that he rediscovers his purpose, that in quieting down and listening to the whisper, he could hear God's leading. He could step into what he needed to do. And he finds he's not alone. And he finds support, and he now finds renewed purpose and renewed energy. And the thing that's so funny to me as I read that is that all these things that Elijah finds are in a place where he had already been. But he didn't see it the last time it was there. Now, why didn't he see it the last time he was there? Now, one possibility is that it just wasn't time yet. That he had come through initially, and it was kind of a period of waiting. That he just kind of had to wait until it was the right time for things to come together. That is a perfectly valid assumption, and it very well may be. But if I think about the story of the winds and the earthquakes and the fire compared to the whisper, I think for Elijah it was something else. I think for Elijah, his life had become so filled with busyness, with all of his doing. He was doing all the time, and he was busy all the time. That he had gotten so focused on his actions and the doing that he had stopped focusing on his connection with God. And the thing that's important for us to remember is that Elijah did not lose his connection with, he did not lose his connection with God because he had lost his faith. That's not why he lost it. It's actually the other way around. He lost his faith because he had lost his connection with God. Not that God had abandoned him, but in all of his busyness, as he got filled up with all the things he was trying to do, he had stopped taking time to slow down and settle down and connect with God. And by losing that connection to God, he started to lose his sense of purpose. As he lost his sense of purpose, he started to lose hope. And without hope, I'd say it's almost impossible to have any faith. But once he slowed down and settled down and could listen to the whisper, and he found that connection with God again, then his hope was restored. And that's when he rediscovered his purpose. And he was able to discover things that may have been there all along. They may have been, they may not have been. But now he can see them because he's staying connected to God and he's staying in faith. And I think what happens to Elijah is something that can happen in any of our lives. That life is busy. You know, and for you, busy may be different than busy for me, but we all have busy lives. I mean, some of us are just focused on these big accomplishments and these big things we want to do, and we're just focusing on trying to achieve those all the time. And that can start to fill our minds. Some of us are just really busy with family, just taking care of family and kids and grandkids and all those sort of things. Sometimes we're just just busy with being busy. And what happens is that as we do that, as we get so focused on being busy, whatever the cause, we stop focusing on our connection to God. And as we lose that connection with God, or our focus on that connection with God, again, we lose hope. And that causes us to lose faith. So my encouragement for each of us, as we head into the week coming up, that we look at our days, and we look at how we're filling our time, and we look at what are the things that are spinning us up, and what are we doing when things spin us up? When we get stuck, do we just keep trying to pound through, or kind of like me with the GPS going, what's not working, toss it away, I'm just going to keep walking where I'm walking? Or am I going to say, you know what, I think maybe I'm just not catching the signal right now. And maybe I just need to slow down. Maybe I just need to give it more time. Or maybe I need to backtrack a little bit and find that connection. My friends, God wants to be active in your life, and he wants to be in relationship with you. So I just ask that each of us, as we head into the week, let's prioritize that connection. As we've talked about, it doesn't have to be a lot. 5-10 minutes a day can make all the difference. So I encourage each of us to be willing to step out and step into that connection with God.